So hello everyone, I'm Brian Stevens from the Edmonton Nature Club, and Brenda Dale will be speaking tonight about the all the work that goes into doing a breeding survey. So I'll pass it over to Brenda and let her go.
Well, thank you, Brian.
Oh, sorry, one thing. If you have any questions as we go along, please put them in the chat and we'll review them at the end. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for taking some time to spend with us on this topic tonight. So my main purpose is to do some step-by-step preparation for those of you who may have signed up or are seriously considering signing up for the North American Breeding Bird Survey. It's also good background for assistance. But this workshop won't be about how to do generic bird surveys, and it's not really about how to identify birds. It's very specifically about preparing to do this important bird survey. So I'm presuming the people here were listening to my earlier talk to the club, and you know how much value there is for the North American Breeding Bird Survey for bird conservation. And your interest, I hope, reflects an interest in participating and helping with that bird conservation. And my main goal in offering all this is to help make the process, doing the breeding bird survey is different than just birding. And so even people who are amazing birders still have some difficulty because it's just very different to what they're used to. And I just hope that by giving people some pointers, some explanations, that hopefully I will minimize your frustration so that you will enjoy your experience of participating in the breeding bird survey and continue to do it for many years and contribute to bird conservation. So the first thing I'm just going to say is your package will arrive. So for those of you who are signed up, you probably have your package, or if not, it's coming in the next few days. And so everything technically that you need is in that package. So most people now are receiving it electronically. So there's a file that has a sign in it. So print that and use it, carry it in your car, display it in your car. There's a volunteer agreement, which you should print out, sign, and return. Or actually, it's probably a PDF you can sign and return without even having to print it out. There's information on safety, and I'm going to talk some more about safety. And there is a route map, and along with telling you where the route is and the exact path that it follows, it also gives you the start time for your route and the start location. And then there will either be an already completed route description or a form to fill out if there is no route description on file. Then there's sort of a simplified version of the instructions, but within that PDF, there's a link you can click if you want the more detailed instructions. And so those things will be there, but I am going to touch on quite a few of the things that are in the instructions tonight. And then the last thing that's there is your scan forms for entering your data. And that includes your observer identification. And again, it gives you your start time. So the first thing I want to talk about is safety. So it's very, very important, obviously, that you stay safe while you're doing this, because it is a roadside survey. So there's a number of things that can be different, maybe in terms of safety issues than when you're regularly birding. So there is a detailed list of the precautions in the package that you will have received electronically. And they refer to things about your personal health. So things like proper clothing, sunscreen, insect repellent, that sort of thing. Car safety, so the main things there, of course, are making sure your car is in good repair, that you have lots of gas, that you make sure you have air in your tires. Let me tell you from personal experience, I drove for, I think it was 3 years or 4 years, using the special little thing that undoes the nuts on my car tires at home, not thinking about the fact that if I had a flat somewhere, I couldn't change my tire because I have that. So make sure you have everything you need. Fortunately, I didn't have a flat tire, but it could have happened. So make sure you have everything you need there. Make sure your lights are in good working order, all that sort of thing. It talks a bit about traffic hazards. So one of the main things there will just be depend on the kind of road that you're on. So if you're on a busy road, then the hazards will be more about traffic and making sure that there's very safe places to park. And other kinds of roads, it might be more about, well, other kinds of hazards that could come up on any road are if there's construction going on or something like that. And then there's road conditions. So personally, I'm happy that most of my routes are on gravel roads. But if it's raining, then the road conditions can be difficult. And so you may or may not be able to run your route if you're on a gravel road. The reason I prefer the gravel roads is they're actually quieter, because on a paved road, you can hear other traffic coming for a surprisingly long way. And another thing it refers to is emergency contact. Be sure to make sure that other people know where you're going, when you're expected back, all that sort of thing, that you have good communication, that you have a cell phone. Now, in some places there isn't good coverage, but hopefully you have cell phone coverage. And as I say, there's more detail on it there, but there's a lot of issues there, and definitely read it and make sure that you're following it. So here's a little bit more. Again, it mentioned route conditions, breakdown, dangerous wildlife. Well, there can be dangerous wildlife in the form of something that comes out of the woods while you're doing your count, but there can also be dangerous wildlife when it comes to getting to your route. So the start times are very early. So you're starting really before it's light. And that means you're traveling when it's basically dark or just becoming light. And that's a very dangerous time for deer and moose and so on to be moving around. And I have unfortunately killed a deer, and I cannot tell you how many close calls with deer when I've been driving to my route. And I always drive very much lower than the speed limit when I'm driving, and I allow a lot of extra time to get to the beginning of my route because of deer. To me, that's one of the most important things to do, is to drive well below the speed limit and allow a lot of time to get to your route, even though it means you have to get up very early to do that. So insect bites can be a big problem. Dehydration can be a problem, especially if it starts to get warm quickly. The weather, obviously, there can be rain, wind, there can be fog, which can cause issues with visibility, that sort of thing. And sleep deprivation can be a real issue. So I mentioned how it takes a while to potentially get to the beginning of your route if you allow time for driving slowly. And then if you're very tired, you could be very hard to doze off. This is one of the great things about having your assistant with you, is hopefully they'll keep you awake. But getting enough sleep is extremely important. So read all the materials, wear a safety vest if you can, and properly layered clothing, because it can be quite chilly first thing, and it might be very warm by the time you're done. So layers are good. Have sunscreen. I don't normally like a hat, but I wear a hat because it does keep the sun out of your eyes, and it's actually what I apply the repellent to rather than to myself. Make sure you have food, water, a means of communication, tell someone where you're going. Main thing is get sufficient sleep and train for getting up early. So I think I mentioned this during the talk to the club. I start getting up 15 minutes earlier each week as I get closer to the breeding bird survey. So right now I'm getting up at 4:30, and by the time I'm ready to leave to do BBS, I'll be getting up at 4 or earlier. So then when I have to shift to getting up at 3:30, it's no big deal. I'm not tired. I'm just going to bed early. So I guess another important thing is possibly a sleep mask, because it helps you to get to sleep early when it's already still quite sunny out in the evening. Plan your timing so you can drive slowly. So once you've determined where your route is and how far a distance it is from where you're staying, then figure out exactly how long it'll take you at going much slower. So I go 60 to 70 kilometers an hour on a highway that would normally be 100 kilometers, and I only go 30 to 40 kilometers an hour on a gravel road. So work out on your own route how long you think it will take you to get there, because you don't want to be late. For myself, I always know the nearest detachment and have the phone number in my phone, so that if I did run into difficulties, I could phone the local RCMP detachment and ask for assistance. So there is a map that you can get on the internet that shows where all the various detachments are, and you can figure out where what detachment your route is in. So this is the first page from the route map. This is from one of my routes, but your map will look similar. So on the lower right, there's a square that shows the location of the map on the left side within a bigger area. So in this case, the only probably thing you would find on a bigger map is the towns of Empress and Bindloss. So this lets you orient where your route will be, and then the route map is in I think it's 4 pages, and it shows you the route, the details of the route in sections, including the location of each stop. And so I've circled the start point here, and it's very important that you start where they say to start and not say run the route in reverse and start at the other end and come back. In this case, I often have to stay in Empress, so it'd be very handy to be able to start at that end, but you have to start where it is indicated on the map, and it's by the people panel at the top, but the start time is shown on the top of the map. So then there's various pages as you go through the entire route, and one thing, I don't want to insult anybody, but many people from the city don't necessarily know the rural system. So we're lucky in Alberta in that all the township roads that go east and all the range roads that go north-south are labeled with signs. So when you have a map like this that shows you the range roads and the township roads, it's actually fairly easy to find your way to the beginning or end of a route, and to find your way along the route. And of course, your stops are located basically every half mile along this 24.5 mile, 40 kilometer long route. So we're just moving along here, and that's the way your route map will look. So when you go out, and you don't need to wait, if your route is within reasonable driving distance of home, I wouldn't even recommend waiting until it's time to do your BBS to go get familiar with it, and to make sure that you can find all the stops and update the route description if you need to, or do the geographic positioning system if you need to. I wouldn't wait. And these, I feel these maps are fairly helpful, but if you have any questions about that, you can always contact me afterwards. So this is the route description that comes with that route. Now this one is done. And I wrote it as if the next person after me wouldn't know really much of anything. So I make references to, I give kind of descriptions of things as I go along. And the very top of it, it gives you directions to get to the start. So in this case, you know, if you're on Highway 555, when you get to Range Road 2-5, you go 12.8 kilometers south. And if you're coming from the other direction, there's another way to measure it in, so that from either direction you can get to that point. And then I use things that are readily available in the prairies. Well, the things that are available, say in the forest, might not be the same as these, but in the agricultural areas, there are fences and fields and regular roads, fairly regular roads, or at least trails. And there are legal stakes. So there are a lot of things to use for stop descriptions. But there are still some places where there's nothing, as in this case down here, and then you just have to just go with distance. But you wouldn't want to have to do your whole route by just going distance. That would be very difficult. So if there is a description, then you would need to complete a route description yourself. And if the points have not been geographically referenced, then that would also be good if you could do that. And if you're not planning to use GPS, you can use GPS as your route description. You can do the whole route by just going to certain reference points. I personally don't find that to be something I can do as quickly. I like to do one where I can be driving along at a fairly decent clip for the first 600 meters, and then start watching for my marker that is visible. So something like a fence line or an approach, which is a short roadway that's going off the road into a field, or even a legal stake. I can see that as I'm coming up to the stop, and I can stop. Whereas if you're doing GPS, if you're going at any speed, the GPS is not necessarily keeping up with you, and you may actually go past the stop and have to back up a little bit. But it's all what you're comfortable with. And later on, I'm going to mention practicing just going from point to point. And that might be a time for you to determine which kind of method you'd like to use. So once you have if you have to complete a route description, then you need to enter it online and update it through time. So some of my routes I've been doing for 25 years, and I've updated them several times because things change. And you have to make sure that you keep your route description up to date. So when you're setting them up, setting up stops, there are situations where you can move a stop by up to 100 meters from the 800-meter interval that you're supposed to use. And examples of that would be for safety. Now, say there was no shoulder whatsoever. Maybe there's guardrails right up to the edge of it, and there's nowhere to safely park. Or say there's a small hill just before you get to your stop. Well, then you would be parked just over the edge of a hill, and a vehicle coming on your side of the road would not necessarily see you until they came over the top of the hill, and that would be dangerous. So you could move your stop back a bit to where you're more visible, or more forward to where you're visible. Another example would be sound. If there's really excessive continuous noise, say a mill or a compressor station, then again, you can move your route, your stop by up to 100 meters to try and lessen that noise. And for myself, if I've had a curve, I tend to use the legal system. So in agricultural areas, there is a quarter section marker of some sort every half mile for sure. And I don't like to get off that. I like to be going to, a fence line, then a road, then a fence line, then a road. It's really much easier to navigate. And so if I've had a curve that slightly puts me off of that, I'll go a little bit less or a little bit more to get back onto the fence lines and the road lines. And so, if you have to move something by quite a bit, then you should contact the national coordinator and talk to them about it. But if there's safety involved, then, they're almost certainly going to say that you should change it. You can skip a stop altogether if it's dangerous. So say you were going out to set up your route, and there's something that makes it very dangerous, like something like I mentioned, like maybe there's a great long period where there's guardrails and there's nowhere to pull off safely. Well, then you could skip a stop and then add a stop at the end of the route. So you still got 50 stops, but there's just a 1 mile gap in there somewhere. You could do that if it's dangerous. You can also, that's a permanent change. You can also skip a stop any given year if it's dangerous. I have more than once pulled away from a stop as soon as I started my count, or even before I started my count, because a farmer is spraying pesticides and the wind is blowing it directly towards me. And I'm not going to stand there for 3 minutes breathing in pesticides, so I will skip that stop for that year. And you don't have to add a stop at the end. They can analyze it with just 49 for a situation like that. So this is a map from another one of my routes. This is from my Dorothy route, and I just put this up here to show examples of the two things I just said. So here I had a curve that got things kind of out of whack as far as roads and fence lines. This, as it turns out, is all ranching country, so there aren't a lot of roads and there aren't a lot of fences. But when I was approaching a new bridge, I went a little bit further than 800 meters in order to make my stop on the road at the intersection with the road. And then as I moved along here, this square right here is a compressor station, and it's extremely noisy. So I went 900 meters from stop 46 to stop 47, and then just 700 meters to stop 48 in order to give myself a little bit more distance from that noisy state compressor station. So those are examples of how you can move off of the 800 meter, strict 800 meter, when it will help for safety. So things that are good stop markers are things that are easy to spot as you're approaching. And obviously it's best if they are likely to be permanent, because you don't want to have to come up with something new every year. So if you can, use the legal system, because it's also designed on half-mile intervals. So you can use an intersection, whether it's the intersection of the road you're on with another road or with a trail. You can use the fence lines that are perpendicular to the, not the one parallel to the road, but the one perpendicular to the road, because that's almost certainly going to be on a quarter-mile line. And you can also use legal stakes, because the land has all been surveyed. There are usually legal stakes actually every 200 meters along roads. They're not always easy to see. You kind of have to develop a search image for them. Other things you could use would be a yard or field access approach. Those are also good markers, because those are usually also on a half-mile. Well, yard isn't always, but it sometimes is. And the reason I put down some stars by courtesy call is, especially if you're going to do a stop very close to someone's house. Now, some farm yards are well back, that wouldn't be such an issue. But if you have a farmyard that's right by the road and you're going to be stopping there very early in the morning, if you get an opportunity to talk to that landowner, go and introduce yourself and tell them what you'll be doing, so that they won't be wondering why there's a car driving by at 4:30 in the morning or 5 o'clock in the morning. Especially, I found in ranch country, that's definitely a good idea to make that kind of courtesy call, because for them, most of the time, if they hear somebody going by at that hour, it's somebody that's rustling cattle or stealing equipment, so they're not going to feel very happy about it. So if they know it's you, and you do that every year for a number of years, they're quite pleased with you. And many times, BBSers will come up with very close relationships with some of the people that they stop by and meet every year. I know of a case, one of the observers from Calgary, where he was approached by one of the farmers on the route he did all the time, because there's going to be a development, and this fellow wanted to know if they could use the data from the bird survey to make them put the development somewhere else. And they were able to help him out, and everybody was happy. So this is just a couple of examples. So this is a picture of a legal stake. Now, they're not always that nice and easy to see. Sometimes they're over closer to the fence. Sometimes they're not orange. Sometimes they've been hit by a few things and they're a little bent. But that is a legal survey marker, and it's quite a helpful marker for a stop description. And this is an approach into a field. So this is just a short section of roadway that just goes into the field. And that's also helpful. And it's also not likely to be used during the time you're stopped, and it's a great place to pull off safely. So the instructions, if you get the printed version, and I'm not, I'm just putting them out there to show that there's a lot of detail, and we are going to go over at least some of it. But you should read it all. And if you have questions after reading it and after doing this workshop, send me an email and I'll try and answer your questions. So a little bit of background about those instructions. So the breeding bird survey is an index. It's a count. It's not a complete count. You're almost certainly not going to get a complete count unless it's an absolute wasteland and there's not very many birds. What you're trying to do is to capture a consistent proportion of what is there. So the protocol for the breeding bird survey controls for things that can influence that proportion. So you're controlling for things that alter the bird observability, and you're controlling the observer's activities that influence the count. So that's what most of the instructions are about, is about trying to keep that proportion that you are able to observe and count similar from year to year and from stop to stop. So things that influence count: the time of day, the time of year, the observer, weather, the duration of the count, and noise. I'm going to talk about most of those things. Oh, sorry, I guess I didn't have specific slides for some of them. So time of day, obviously most birds sing more strongly early in the day. And as the temperature goes up over the day, and as they get busier and busier feeding their young and so on, the call rate goes down. So that's why it's important that you are reaching the same point on your route at about the same time year after year after year, because that way you're keeping that variable sort of thing steady from year to year. The same thing with the time of year. When they are advertising for mates and so on, they're singing more often than they are when they actually have babies. So, and then as we all know, as summer progresses, they're hardly singing at all. So the time of year influences the count. And again, you would hope to try and do your count around the same time each year to keep that influence the same. Observer makes a difference. Even if you're a good birder, everybody has their own style. And maybe as time goes by, you might learn more, or your ears might get worse, or various things. So from observer to observer, the proportion that you're going to capture will vary. And that isn't right or wrong. All you're looking for is to keep it the same. So that's why you wouldn't want to say, oh, I can't run my BBS this year, I'll get somebody else to run it for me. That's not really helping. And it also wouldn't help to have your assistant help you sometimes and not others. It's important that the assistant doesn't help you. And whether, we're going to get to that in a minute. I did mention the duration. Obviously, the longer you count, the more birds you're going to get, and noise. The more noise there is, the more it's going to interfere. So at the start and at the finish, and every stop, you record the wind speed. So there's 5 categories in, well, no, 6 in this Beaufort wind speed codes, and generally speaking, you don't go beyond a 3. So if it gets to the point where the wind is higher than that, you're going to have difficulty hearing. In the prairies, you're going to have problems because you're going to be so exposed, and you're going to only be able to hear things on maybe from one direction. And in more wooded areas, the problem will be that there'll be so much leaf noise that it will be difficult to hear. Then there's also, of course, thrown in the fact that the birds are not singing at the same rate either under highly windy conditions. So generally speaking, in most areas, you would be stopping if it went above a 3. In the prairie experience, you may be able to do it at a 4, but if you reach the point where you really are only hearing birds from one side of the road, it's time to quit. Now, obviously, most people are not going to take a wind meter with them, so they give you some clues here as to how you would judge what the wind is. But mainly, you're going to know. If you're having that much trouble hearing the birds, it's probably gone too high. And you're going to know these ones here, they're pretty easy. It's like there's no wind, virtually no wind. You can barely feel it. Man, it's getting there. Leaves are starting to rustle too. Getting up there, but I can still hear the birds too. Okay, I can't hear the birds. And at the beginning and the end of the survey and every 10 stops, you record the sky conditions. So obviously you can proceed if there's a clear sky, partly sky, or even an overcast sky, because the birds will still be singing and you will still be able to see them and hear them. If there's fog or smoke, so long as it doesn't last for very long or isn't very dense, you can continue. I've had it where I had to stop for fog for 10 or 15 minutes and the wind eventually blew it away. Or sometimes if it's not very heavy and it's not dangerous to drive, you can try a couple of stops because you may get past it. It might just be because of low-lying conditions. If there's just a very light drizzle, you can keep going. But if it's interfering with you hearing, or if it persists for very long, then obviously the birds are going to not be singing as much and you need to stop. And then you can wait for a little while. You have a maximum of 5 hours to finish the survey. So if you end up having to wait for more than half an hour or an hour, you're not going to get done in time anyway. And you might be better to come back and try and finish it another day. But if you can just wait out a short drizzle, it might only last a few minutes, then you can carry on and it won't affect the overall quality of your survey. Obviously, if there's steady showers or snow, you can't continue. So singing varies with temperature. So you record the temperature at the beginning and the end for certain. Sure, I normally record it every 10 stops just in case. They don't actually have a place. They tell you to do it, but as far as I know, they don't have a place for you to record it. But they may eventually want that data, and that's part of why they want your original data sheets, because they can look that kind of stuff up and add it if they find a way to use it in the analysis. You can carry a thermometer. If you do so, you need to keep it somewhere where it won't be in the sun. So I used to keep it in the back of my truck where I could just quickly grab it and look at it. But I had to make sure that it was in a place that was in the shade in the back of my truck. Or you can use the one in your car. They're generally fairly accurate. So the part about what you can count during the breeding bird survey. You can count all breeding birds, so you can't count obvious migrants and you don't count babies. So all the breeding birds seen or heard by the observer, not by anybody else, by the observer in 3 minutes within a 400-meter radius of your stop. If you hear a bird or see a bird and you can't identify it, you can stay very briefly after to try and identify it, or come back afterwards after you've done the whole survey. If so long as you saw that individual during the 3-minute time period, but you couldn't identify it, you can come back. Or you can make a recording of a bird you can't identify and identify it later. So you make some note about an unidentified bird and maybe the recording number, and then later on when you identify it, then you can enter that onto your data sheet. Don't use an app to ID a bird during the count. So like, don't use Merlin, for example, to ID a bird during the count. Part of the reason is because it's a distraction. It's taking away from listening to other birds. And it's, it goes back to this thing about it's not necessarily a complete count. You're just doing the best you can and trying to be consistent. So if you have a situation where you're finding there's a lot of species you can't identify, a lot of calls you can't identify, then it may mean you need to do quite a bit of homework before you do the route again. You shouldn't attract birds, so no fishing or using recordings to call, say, get a Sora to answer, things like that. Try not to double count. So each time you hear a bird call, it's not a new bird. It's maybe the same bird calling again. So I normally try and go with only calling it a single bird unless I hear another bird call immediately after from a obviously different location, or maybe even 2 or 3 or 4, but they singing one after the other and it's clear that they're different birds. Or you do hear it and then you hear another call later, but it's so far apart that it wouldn't be the same individual. So try not to double count because you're not necessarily helping anything. Again, it's an index. Don't count the species you saw or heard only while scouting. So there's, of course, very disappointing when you're coming out and you're previewing your route, you see some really neat bird or hear some really neat bird, and then it shuts up during your count. It's disappointing, but you can only record what is seen and heard during those 3 minutes. And again, so don't count birds seen or heard outside the 3 minutes, even when you pull up. So say you pull up and you haven't started your timer, or you finish, your timer goes off and you turn around to get in the car and some other species calls. You can't record those. The one thing I will say is, well, oftentimes in the prairies, I pull up, well, I won't say often, but sometimes it happens that sharp-tailed grouse or gray partridge will flush, when you get out of your vehicle. Well, I start my timer as fast as I can and keep my eye on them. So long as they're still in sight when I start my timer, I can count them. But if something happens to call or be seen only once, before or after, then you can't count it. You can make a note about it if you want, but don't count it. You don't count the babies or obvious migrants. So those would be species that are not in breeding range. So say had a lesser yellow legs down in the prairies. I mean, that would be. You don't count the birds seen or heard only by the assistant. And if you get something that you think is pretty rare, record a few details, because when you go to enter the data, they will undoubtedly ask you how certain you are about the identification. So while you're counting, be as quiet as possible. You want to look and listen in all directions. So you may want to turn, but don't move more than necessary. Especially gravel roads, your foot noises can be quite loud. And another note is, if you're not already aware of it from your own birding, when you're moving, a bird may sound like it's coming from a completely different direction. So if you just heard a bird call and then you're turning and you hear that same species from totally the opposite direction, I wouldn't necessarily write that down as a second individual till I heard it call again, because it may actually just be your ears playing tricks on you. If you do have an assistant, then keep your voices low. Don't talk except to say the bird name or number if you have that assistant. And it's optional as to whether the observer or assistant tracks the time. So for those assistant recorders, you write down the species seen and heard by the observer. You may also help out in other ways by reading out the stop description as you're traveling from stop to stop, or you can do the driving and let the observer do the navigating. You can track time, you can record weather, the vehicles, noise. Please don't record the birds only you heard or point out birds to the observer, even though that's very difficult not to do. If they ask your opinion on a bird identification, you may give it. So if they say, oh, do you think that was you, and you think it was, you can tell them that you agree with that. So I can't remember if I have it somewhere else in the notes, but you do record the vehicles that pass you. Not vehicles you can hear off in the distance, but vehicles that pass while you're doing the count. And if the noise is excessive for more than, I think it's either 20 or 30 seconds, to the point where it interferes with your counting, you can record that as a noise event. And if it's bad enough, you can add 30 seconds to the count in order to make up for that noise interfering. So this is, sorry, a very bad Xerox of the kind of scan sheet that they would send you with your package. So the main things I want to point out about this is just this particular kind, they are showing the most common species that have been observed on the route before, and it's for 5 stops only. So it is a place that you can record everything, especially if you have an assistant. But personally, I find having to look up and down rows of names, looking for the right species, making sure I'm in the right column. It's a lot to do while I'm trying to listen and watch for birds. And actually, I think it's a lot even for the assistant to have to do. Personally, I prefer a system more like this. Again, I apologize, it's not the greatest quality of copy. But what I do is I just have my own sheet that's divided into 10 stops, and I just only have to have 5 pages in order to cover all 50 stops. I write down the right preface, so in this case it's stop 21 down to stop 30. I put in my very brief route description, so here it's stake left, road both, stake left, road right, no distance only, trail right, so on. So I have my brief stop descriptions down there, and then I write down my time as I start my count. I use my 4-letter acronyms, and then I add a dot for each additional individual that I record. And there's a place here for temperature, wind, and sky at the top of the page. And missing underneath there is the details about the route and the page number and the start and end time for that page. So I'm not saying you need to use something exactly like this. I'm just saying this is an option. You can use whatever system you think will work consistently well for you, and that you can understand and be able to transcribe, because you will eventually have to enter the data, so that you will know exactly what stop you saw what at, how many individuals there were, and have track that they will keep track of, like wind and sky. In this case, I had a vehicle on stop 28 and I had excessive noise at stop 29. So if you're going to be able to record all those things, whatever system you have is good. The Breeding Bird Survey Office does need the original data sheets, so you need to be able to either copy them or take a scan of them and send them electronically, but they need a copy of the original sheets. So I'm not sure, I wasn't quite sure what order to do this in, but I've talked a bit about some of the instructions about how to actually do the survey. But I want to talk about that transition from birding to the breeding bird survey. So many people are very birders and certainly able to identify all the birds that they might encounter on a breeding bird survey. But it's still quite an adjustment to going from birding to doing the breeding bird survey. So you need to know the birds by sight and sound on your own. So not where you're in a group and you can ask somebody if you have some difficulty with a given species. Time is limited. You only have 3 minutes at each stop, and you must finish the overall 50 stops in less than 5 hours. You can't use methods to draw out birds. You can't use apps during the count. Your location is predetermined, and it may be quite boring. Whereas, you know, birders tend to go to places where there's a lot of interesting birds, and who can blame you? The distance is limited, so it's not anything you can see in here. It's anything you can see in here within 400 meters. In forest, this is probably not a huge issue because you're not likely to be able to hear things further than that. But in the prairies, you definitely can. And it's roadside and trailside only. So, for example, if you were birding in a park and you heard or saw something that you wanted to go check on afterwards, well, you can walk wherever you need to go get that. But if you're on a road or a trail and the land just outside the ditch is somebody's private property, you can't go chase that bird down. You can only get another look at it if it shows itself. So there's other things to keep track of: wind, sky, temperature, vehicles, noise. So there's a lot that has to get done in those 3 minutes, and it's a lot more constrained than your regular birding. So those are the things that I'm going to talk about now for how to hopefully make the transition from birding to BBS, so that you can enjoy your BBS almost as much as you enjoy your regular birding. So this is basically a checklist to prepare. So the thing is to know the birds, to make sure you know the birds. So if you go to the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey's Breeding Bird Survey page, the first page says participate in the survey, and there's a little thing, enter data or join. It's not actually very intuitively obvious that that's how you get to more details about the survey. But anyway, if you click on that, then you'll get this page, and you can click on vacant routes, and it takes a few minutes to come up. And eventually when it does, you'll see a map with some dots representing routes, and then you'll see a list that you can scroll down through of available routes. Those are in red. Now, if you've already selected your route, it'll be in black, but whether it's red or black, if you find a route you're interested in, so this is something to do if you've already selected a route, to make sure you know the birds that are on the route. But if you're prospecting for what route you might be interested in, you can go through this list and look at the species list to try and find a route that might be suitable for you. So anyway, if you find a route and you click on the info beside it, then this will pop up, and two of the options are species list and count data. So the species list is a list of all the species that have ever been encountered on that route, ever. Whereas the count data shows the data by species for each year. So you might look through the species list and say, wow, that looks really interesting. But it's probably a good idea to look at the count data and make sure that some of many of those species are still being encountered, because it may be that some of them have disappeared from the route. But anyway, this is a way for you to identify prospective route, and it's also a way to find out what birds you are most likely going to need to know in order to be able to do your breeding bird survey. And then you can work on making sure that you know those birds. So I mentioned Dendriaka before. It's one module within the Nature Instruct website. It's free. If you sign up, if you register with it, then you can create custom lists so that you can be learning just the birds you're most interested in, and you don't have to look through 700 species in this little drop-down list. And there are multiple images and multiple songs for each species on this website, and it's one way to do it. Obviously, there's many apps out there you can pay for, and then there's Merlin, I understand, is free. But I personally find this quite useful, and I use it to warm myself up every year by going through the list of species I'm most likely to encounter, making sure I still remember what they all are. Because there is a quiz function where you can have a list of species that you're checking yourself on, and it will not show you an image. It will simply play you a song. You click on the one you think it is and press select. If you get it right, it'll show you the it'll say you're correct, and it'll show you the picture. And if you get it wrong, it will, I can't remember. I think it will play it again, or no, I guess it shows you the species that it should be, and it gives you a chance to familiarize yourself again with the song. So having learned the birds and being pretty sure, then if you're not going to use the data sheets that the Breeding Bird Survey provides, then you need to learn bird acronyms if you don't already. I think most people probably know bird acronyms, but if you don't, the BBS data entry system uses the banding acronyms. That doesn't mean you have to use them. Any system you use is fine, so long as you're consistent and you know what the abbreviation means. I always go over my field sheet immediately after to make sure my writing is clear. And then I enter the data as soon as possible to make sure I remember what all the codes mean. There's some things that change, so, you know, and some things I just can't make myself use the banding codes for. So you can work together, the observer and the assistant, or the assistant can enter the data, whatever works. And then you should check, and double check before submitting it. And even at that, they will still send it back to you one more time for checking. So read the instructions. Again, that's the next step. Make sure that you understand the instructions, and if you have questions, that you contact me or the national coordinator to get your questions answered. Practice finding specific locations. So this doesn't have to be on your assigned route. You can find a safe road near Edmonton here and practice on it and create route descriptions for 10 or 20 locations. That gives you practice on how to come up with good route stop location descriptors, and it also gives you a place to practice. You can use these 10 or 20 locations for your practice sessions, so you are also practicing efficiently moving from point to point while doing some of the birding exercises. So my goal is to get as quickly as possible from one stop to the next. So again, that's why you want good stop descriptors, because you need to be able to move fairly quickly between, and then be stopping, just slowing down and stopping when you're getting very close to the point. Because with only 5 hours, it takes, that's 300 minutes. And if you just do the stops alone, 50 times 3, that's 150 minutes. So you only have another 3 minutes max to get to the next stop. Do any recording of things, maybe hunt down the odd bird. So you couldn't be hunting down birds on every stop, or you'd never get done in five hours. But you want to be able to move efficiently from one point to the next. So that's something you can practice. Practice counts. So start off, don't worry about the duration of the count. Don't worry about the time of day. Just stay in one spot and count what you see and hear and record it using the system you plan to use during the breeding bird survey, and then move to a new stop and repeat that. Start thinking about how you're going to handle flocks or large numbers that you won't possibly be able to finish counting in 3 minutes. Because again, it doesn't matter, I'm not going to say which is the one and only system, but it matters that you do it consistently. So you want to try and figure out, okay, how do I estimate flock numbers? Or what am I going to do if there's just so many of these? Am I going to do just species and then go back for numbers? What am I going to do? You have to make a decision and try and be ready to use it consistently. And make sure you keep listening while you are looking and writing. So practice estimating 400 meters. It's more of an issue in open country than it is in forests, because you're going to need to practice determining how far you can hear loud species or see birds. So I can easily hear a meadowlark more than 400 meters away, and I can hear it more than that as well. I can hear it and I can see it, actually, if it's sitting on a telephone post or something. I can see it. So as you approach, when you're doing your practice ones and you know your points are 800 meters apart, when you're at 400 meters, start noting features so that if you see a bird, you'll be able to say, oh, well, it's closer than that post I noticed, or pole I noticed, or special tree I noticed. So it's got to be within my 400 meters. In the prairies, I use telephone poles. I know about approximately how many telephone poles there are in half a mile. So I know how many are in a quarter mile, which is 400 meters, quarter mile. So I know how many, if that meadowlark or that hawk is sitting 8 poles back, it's too far away. As you're coming to a stop, if you pass a visible bird that will be within 400 meters of your stop, then check when you get out. And if it's still visible, then count it as fast as you can. And on the other hand, if you see a bird on a post in the distance, between you and the next stop, then you can write it down. And then as you're moving to the next stop, keep an eye on your odometer. If it was within 400 meters, you leave it there. If it was outside 400 meters, you cross it off and hope that it stays still and you can count it at the next stop. Then practice 3-minute counts. Limit the time. Choose your timing method. So some people will want to use a stopwatch. Some people will want to use an egg timer. A timer. And some people may even want to use their phone. I recommend against your phone because it's one more thing you've got to keep track of, whereas a timer or watch kind of can come along with you. Write down this time and start keeping track of the species, most important, and then the numbers. It may take you a while before you feel comfortable with this. That's okay. Once you get more comfortable, then you can start limiting your distance as well. And then when you start to get more comfortable, then practice 10 or 20 of those in as fast a succession as you can manage, because it builds up your ability to concentrate. People who are really good birders find, many people who do the breeding bird survey find it very mentally exhausting by the end of the day, because you are concentrating hard for 53-minute periods. And so you can build up your ability to concentrate like that by practicing 10 or 23-minute stops in succession. So then, up until now, we haven't worried too much about the time of day. Then try practicing early, because the birds will be singing more vociferously, and it will be more of a challenge. And it also is a way of making sure that you're, well, not making sure, but it's a way of getting up earlier and getting used to being up earlier. So that is the checklist this is the checklist now for what you should do to get ready. So you're going to do those exercises that I just mentioned, if you're not already comfortable with the idea of a 53-minute count. You're going to assemble all the materials. In the instructions, they tell you what all you need to have with you. And you're going to make sure your vehicle is in good repair, full of gas, headlights are working, all those things. You're going to scout. As I mentioned earlier, there's no need to wait until the last minute to scout. You can do it many weeks before you do your breeding bird survey if it's in a convenient location. Locate the start and the other 49 points. Either familiarize yourself with the existing route description, or else complete the route description or update the existing one if you found that there were a few changes. All the time you're doing all those things, of course, you can be listening for birds and making sure you're comfortable with identifying them. Plan your morning. I mentioned this before. So many of my routes, I start off an hour ahead of time, because I've worked out the distance. I've figured out how long it will take me to go, going at a fairly slow pace, safe pace, if there's deer. And you also need to, of course, I have everything laid out the night before so that I don't have to spend very long at all. Once I get up, I'm out the door in about 10 minutes, 15 minutes at the most. And one of the ways to save time, which you may or may not be able to deal with, is I don't drink coffee till I'm done. Then you should be ready, and just go slowly. So my top tips are: start getting up earlier each week so time is not such a shock. Do be sure to carry along the spare key on your person, not in the vehicle. I have on at least 3 occasions accidentally locked the driver's door as I got out. And fortunately, most of the times it happened, I was able to at least get in through the passenger door. And one other time it happened, we did have a spare key in a magnetic box under the frame of the truck, and I was able to get in. But that could have been a disaster. So I normally carry it in my pocket, and if I don't have pockets in my pants, then I use a clip and clip it onto my bino strap so that I cannot possibly be caught outside the car without keys. Put your timer either on your wrist, if it's a watch, or on your clipboard. Here I've got a timer attached to my clipboard, or on your bino strap or harness. And I personally recommend wearing gloves and a hat because it's often very cool. And if you do have to apply bug dope, you can apply it to the gloves and the hat instead of to your skin. Those are my personal tips. Oops, sorry. So you're going to go ahead and try. Oh, look, my little sad face is behind the icon there. Hopefully you can see it. So what if things don't work out? The weather causes you a problem. There's a mechanical issue. Well, note where you stopped. So I stopped at stop 23, and I was there at this time. Then if you come back, you can restart on another day at that exact time and stop where you were interrupted. You don't have to start all over again at the beginning if you don't want to. If the weather was kind of crummy the whole way through, you might want to start over completely. But if whatever stopped you was fairly sudden and you felt like your count had been good quality up to a certain point, then you can start at the time and location where you were interrupted. And if things did go well, then congratulations. Do the wind, the sky, the temperature one more time at the last stop. Check over your data sheets while it's still fresh in your mind. When you go to do the data entry online, there are 2 choices for the entry method. If you use the enter as you go method, if you use the wrong 4-letter code, you'll get an error, but it's not usually too hard to figure out how to fix that. After all 50 stops are entered, there's a chance for you to enter any special observations from the field. And if you've seen something that is considered to be relatively rare for the area your route is in, they'll ask for details on that observation of that species. And then check, even double check before submitting. And then a few months later, they will come back to you with the data again and ask you to check it one more time. Mail in or scan and email your original data sheets. And then if you've had to make any changes to your stop descriptions or your GPS or you're entering them for the first time, do that. And you will have made a huge contribution. So I thank you for your interest in the Breeding Bird Survey and in helping to conserve birds. Thank you for your time tonight. And I see we have at least a couple of questions, Brian. Not sure